housing.
We look forward. I look forward. We look forward. Housing. I look forward to public housing. Public housing. I look public housing. I look forward to housing. I look forward.
The chairman. I look forward. Chairman, look to housing. Look forward. Housing or public housing.
Mr. Chairman, public housing. Look, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, housing forward. Private.
Mr. Housing.
Housing. Look
to public
forward.
Housing.
Public, private, the private sector. The private sector.
Housing, public or housing.
To look.
Housing forward. Housing. The housing.
The housing.
Mr. Chairman, the housing. Chairman,
Housing. Public housing.
Mr. Chairman, housing.
A private.
I look forward.
Private. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, forward housing, the public or housing, public housing, or housing. I look forward.
Mr. Chairman, look forward to housing.
Private, look forward.
The private sector.
Housing, the private sector.
Look, Mr. Chairman, housing. We look housing.
Mr. Chairman, public look housing. Housing, public housing. Public housing.
I look forward.
Mr. Chairman,
housing.
Public housing, or public housing. Look.
I look forward to housing.
Mr. Chairman, housing. Look at housing. Look at housing.
Housing forward.
Housing. Look forward. We look forward, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, public housing. Look,
Mr. Housing. Look housing. Forward.
Mr. Look forward housing. Public housing. The public housing.
Mr. Chairman, housing.
I look forward.
Mr. Chairman, I look at housing. Housing. Forward. Housing.
The private sector.
Look private forward. Housing. Look at housing.
Housing. So look.
public, private. The private sector. Housing or private.
The private sector. Housing. The private sector. Look. The private sector.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, we look forward to housing. Look housing. We look housing.
Look forward.
I look forward to housing.
Mr. Chairman, I look forward. I look private housing. I look forward.
Housing, Mr. Chairman. Housing. Public housing. Private housing. Mr. Chairman.
Public, private housing.
Private sector housing.
For private housing.
Look forward.